Yora, Goto Cartor, David Faulkner here, General Manager of Property Brokers Property Management. This isn't Property Brokers where we're at the moment. I'm here with Professor Graham Squires, who is from the Property Knowledge, but also one of the senior lecturers at Lincoln University. Where we
Professor, don't you know?
Professor, yes. Where we are broadcasting from. So I've been down at a Real Estate Institute meeting in Christchurch today. So it's been great that we've been able to use these fantastic facilities here at Lincoln University. I have given lectures before, typically at Massey University, at Graham's previous Jones. And yeah, so anyway, what we're looking at today, and we thought, and this is our latest report, we're looking at New Zealand and how it compares around the world in terms of really just more so with rents, but looking at the cost of, we'll all talk about the cost of living. Is it just New Zealand which is going through real pressure on rents? And we've seen a pressure on house prices. Those house prices have started to come back. They're starting now to level out, and we may see them increase again. Obviously, we've got a general election coming up in the next month, and you know that may not have an impact. It certainly will have an impact, I feel, with how investors feel, because there's going to be some changes around taxation if we see a change of government. And yeah, so really there to look at how New Zealand compares with the rest of the world, Graham.
Yep. I think the things to bear in mind as we run through these slides are ideas around global considerations. So we might want to look at how everything's changing across the planet in a sort of a global sense. We'll look comparatively, so we can look at how New Zealand fares against other countries, whether it's Australia, UK, Romania, Sweden, Finland. We'll sort of refer to these places. So there's a sort of a comparative study. We are very mindful that each country has had its own path dependency. The historical sweep of New Zealand is very different to the historical sweep of Sweden, Romania, etc. But this, as well as the global, there's the comparative study that we do here. And another way to research is looking at specific case studies. So if we look within New Zealand, we look within Japan, and we can, so essentially there's different ways that we can compare across the globe, but we need to be mindful of geography, I suppose, in what. So that's the warning, the health warning at the front of this lecture, I guess. But I think this comparative work does illuminate some of the interesting trends and patterns that are happening around the world.
Yeah. So anyway, this is the regional rental report. If you subscribe to our newsletter, you'll be able to download the report and look through it. And it's very, very interesting data in there. We're becoming more and more aware of using data here at Property Brokers to track market rents, to see what's happening with market rents, using data rather than using individual property managers to make those decisions. And also it's good to have Graham on hand so we can compare with how New Zealand sits around the world. And Graham, you want to talk us through this first graph of what we've got here?
Yeah, we're going to huddle around the screen, so you'll be seeing what we see here in terms of slides. What I like about this, if we look at how, I mean, these are from Savills, basically, is the source, and we're looking at over a half-year period, over 6 months, and this is an index change. And what we're seeing here from is 2006 all the way through to 2023. So we can see the broad sweep globally of how particular, what they call prime residential rents. So we're looking at core cities, essentially. So here you'll see 2007, 2008, that sort of fall there, which is?
The GFC.
Correct.
Yep.
Then we see over here sort of your March 2020, which is?
We all know what that is, don't we? Yes.
But what I think is interesting is that the bounce back, you know, we see this sort of fall and this trajectory downwards. And whenever we've hit these sorts of shock events, there's certainly a boom, and then it starts to taper away. You know, just as say here in COVID, boom, and then starts to taper away. So that's the sort of the global sort of patterns that I sort of bring from that particular slide.
Yeah, yeah. And actually, you can get to see the cities, which, I mean, we've got this from Savills. So on the next slide, you'll be able to see the cities that they've compared. What's interesting here, you're looking at this. I mean, cities like Lisbon have got, and this is over a 6-month period, Graham. This is quite extortionate rent growth. I mean, unfortunately, New Zealand isn't in here, or Auckland isn't in here, but you can see the cities that it takes into into comparison around
Yeah,
doing
definitely.
this.
Dubai is always a good sort of reference point because it's quite a sort of irregular global sort of city, relative to sort of Lisbon, which is a well sort of historically entrenched sort of. Singapore's got its own trajectories, I guess, and different sort of market, free market sort of considerations in terms of its housing stock's very unique in the world, I suppose is what I'm saying for Singapore.
Yeah.
But for that to go high, as well as a sort of a traditional Western European sort of city like Lisbon, is quite telling, I'd say.
I mean, that's not sustainable though, is it, Graham? Surely. I mean, you can't have cities go and get 15% rent increases every 6 months. At some point, I mean, rents are primarily a lot, I would say, argued dictated to as much as anything by incomes.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the market's going to talk, but ultimately, if it's coming to a point that's unsustainable for people to pay it, there's going to be lots of noise made about rent caps and all those sorts of things. Particularly if it's at such a sharp rise as well, if it's suddenly over, in 6 month period going over that, that particular change is going to be,
What I find interesting in this one, Graham, is that, I mean, it's over a 6 month period, but you're probably looking at the bulk of them are really around this 2, 3, 4%.
Yep.
Well, my studies on New Zealand, when we're looking at data that I get from MBIE, New Zealand traditionally goes around 4 or 5% per annum.
Yep.
In recent years, it's gone closer to say 7 or 8% per annum.
Mm-hmm.
However, Auckland really hasn't gone at that level of rate. No. We've seen the rents in the provinces where we operate in provincial New Zealand. Rents have gone double digits,
indeed,
10%, and we're probably seeing some of the trends here as well, and some of the other
we're exporting, I suppose, in New Zealand in sort of core city sort of stuff. I think that's a truism that Auckland sort of fallen back a little bit in terms of rents and having. I mean, obviously, it's a significant volume of rents in Auckland compared to other cities around New Zealand. However, the actual median rents that we look at, you can see that sort of change. It's not as significant as it used to be.
And Auckland makes up 1/3 of the rental market in New Zealand. What have we got here, Graham? This is our house price in the OECD, but this takes us up to 2020. Where have we got this information?
Yeah, so OECD, sort of things and number crunching things that I do is, so this is the Organisation for Economics and Economic Cooperation and Development. We get that acronym right, Organisation for Economic and Cooperation and Development. We've got New Zealand, which is sort of essentially top of the heap in terms of house prices. It's familiar ground, isn't it? We know that Auckland's usually on the, it depends on how you look at it, sort of the top of the heap in terms of driving a lot of house price considerations in terms of where we're at. This is indexes.
So this is saying that everyone's starting off on 100 in the year 2000.
Yep.
So what does it mean by 300? Because that's obviously where we are at.
Yep.
And you look at the OECD and the Euro, they're down around the mid 100s, like 140, something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So sort of, so it's going from 100 and so going up another sort of 200 points, basically, index points up.
So this means that New Zealand property, in terms of relation to affordability, it's more than double than what's happened in the OECD.
Yeah, we're talking about
in the Eurozone.
Yeah, you can see that. Second in command there, Canada. Vancouver's always the story in terms of the smaller geographies, in terms of rental issues. We need to be mindful that this is real house prices, so it does take into consideration inflation.
Yeah,
inflation, as we're seeing, is quite a global, globally sort of a concern for all of the OECD countries. But that sort of dampens some of the figures a touch. But
I'm interested to
Ireland
talk about Ireland, Greg, because Ireland got greatly, that kind of got up in that little bubble.
That's right,
around the GFC,
overbuild,
and they had they built too much, and the market absolutely crashed.
Yep,
it's recovered, but it still hasn't reached.
No, it hasn't
the level
it's
not corrected. It's still behind where it was.
Yeah,
I mean, at the commencement of the GFC.
That's right, but a lot of the anecdotal evidence and people I speak to, there's a lot of the ghost towns and the ghost sort of developments that people weren't buying, because there was that sort of real speculative bubble.
Spain was another, wasn't it?
Indeed, they're starting to be brought up, and people are within those properties, but as we sort of intonate, it's at a slower rate. I mean, I would imagine development fell really far back, and you got to remember the development processes can be 5 years. For these big mass developments outside of Dublin, for instance, or the big mass developments outside of Spanish city cores. If they know that they've got to wait another 5 years before they fill because of the previous crisis. That's why we're probably not seeing that rate that the other countries that sort of haven't got that shock.
So from a property investment point of view, I mean, obviously being property brokers and with my commercial hat on, we would like to see people investing in properties in New Zealand. But the real big players and the people who measure the data, what are you saying here that, you know, Ireland and Spain, the only way they can go is up when you look at this, really?
Depends how much of that surplus stock's been taken up with demand now. And, you know, and if we're starting to see a lot more, you know, that slack's been taken up, there's going to be, you know, one eye to sort of develop out more, and the investment part of the portfolio is going to be part of the mix, particularly if we're looking at rents that continue to rise, and we can see people sort of, that feeds into the yields of what people might perceive as as an investment vehicle for them within property. So yeah.
Okay. Do you want to the next slide?
Yeah.
All right. So we're at the top. So we were at the top of housing affordability, or the housing house prices.
Yep.
Now we'll look at the private rents, and this is going up to 2018. You know, and this is, rents have gone up further since then. We're at the top of the pile here, Greg.
Yeah. So I think the important thing to say is just to sort of focus our attention on what this is. So, I mean, 60% of low income private renters are in households that spend more than 40% of their income on rent. So we're looking at low income renters, and 60% of them are spending 40% or more on their rent.
How much is that?
So this is, you'd have to sort of work out the.
I mean, would that be subsidised rent as well? Would you know that data? Because
you can delve into that.
Because the benchmark is typically around a third of your income, no more than a third of your net income should really go on, whether it's your mortgage or whether it's your rent.
Yeah,
that's the benchmark.
That's the benchmark, isn't it?
And we're saying that we've got 60%
of low income.
Yeah, over 40%.
And it's how we sort of take out the low income groups, you know, and it's usually a sort of a certain percentage of median incomes, basically, you know, that's going to be within that 60%. That's, you know, that's how you define low income as well, within that, as well as how much people are going to spend on their actual housing needs. So so yeah, it's pretty woeful statistics when you look at it. It's, you look at housing affordability issues, you look at these sorts of private rents for low income earners, you know, it's certainly it's quite sobering, really, where New Zealand is, when you sort of consider the population profile that we've got. And as you just intimated, that if a third of the country's renting, this is a big issue.
Yeah, it is a big issue.
You know,
and the fact that, I mean, I think we all know this, there's simply not enough social housing in New Zealand. I mean, is this the state's responsibility? I don't want to go too political here, but the state must have a responsibility to build sufficient housing to be able to, you know, I mean, people, you don't want to promote a lifestyle of living off a state house, but you can have 60% of low income people having all their income, basically half their income, going on rent.
Yeah, so I mean, there's private rent, the social rent. There's people move between different rental tenures, I guess. So it needs to be mindful of just sort of not siloing the conversation into social rents and then it's for a certain classification or socioeconomic classification or group. I think we need to be mindful in New Zealand that it is a very small percentage that's social housing. We're talking sort of 4-6%, and that's just been uniform for many, many decades.
Yeah.
So
what should it be?
It's a question of what. Yeah. Well, my question is really, a counter question is, well, what is it for? You know, and I think largely it's a point of debate of whether it's there as a last resort or whether it's sort of part of the fabric of public spending that's meant to support those in need, or whether it's sort of, you know, a genuine asset class that's part of people's life cycle.
Well,
you know, I'm sure when we move into the rent profiles of, say, Western European countries like Sweden, Finland, they'll have a higher percentage of social housing, but that's coming from a whole different trajectory and a whole different historical trajectory where social housing has been interwoven into the fabric and part of the mixed community and the mixed tenure that's at play. But you know, you see where New Zealand's come. Since it comes from a whole different colonial sort of trajectory, doesn't it? In terms of social housing has not been part of that fabric. You know, so
no, people came over here and worked, didn't they?
So I'm sort of I'm dancing around the subject, but I think there is a low. I mean, we do have to remember there is a low proportion of social housing, and the New Zealand approach tends to see it as a continuum that private ownership is the holy grail, and there's a sort of social stigma attached to whatever tenure you're in.
Okay.
So
yeah. On this graph, what we can see, Romania's cracked it, hasn't it? Because this graph is here is showing, people who own the homes outright. They don't have a mortgage. Then you've got properties in the red bar that are owned with a mortgage. Then you've got your rent. Then you've got your subsidised rent, and then other. And New Zealand seems to have a lot of other and a small amount of subsidised rent. So we're really about a third in terms of home ownership outright, home ownership with a mortgage, and then renting.
Yeah, you can see the rent there in purple. That's a small percentage there when we sort of.
That's the rent subsidised, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So these purple figures, you can see the differences. I mean, the sort of the larger ones, they're sort of French social housing. Obviously, there's sort of long legacy there. Interestingly, sort of Ireland.
Can we talk about Germany? Because Germany here, you can see one little point on it. Germany is kind of perceived in New Zealand as the mecca of renting, where you've got home ownership at under 50%. Most of the population rent, and they're on like a long-term lease. They can't be evicted. They can fit out the apartments the way they want. I mean, is that a model that New Zealand should potentially be looking at?
I mean, there's a whole heap of ways in which you can sort of think about this. And I suppose I alluded to mixed tenure approaches. I would certainly argue that New Zealand is very polarised in its view of what public housing is and what private housing is. And intermediate rents is probably where the conversation should sit.
So what do you mean when you say about mixed tenure? Is this like build to rent or?
So within a neighbourhood, you would have a mix of social housing, you'd have a mix of private rent housing, you'd have some owned outright housing, and you can't, in terms of a design point of view, you can't see too much of the differences between those particular properties, but also sort of from a financial sense that there's options for different socioeconomic groups. Those that aren't able to rent are able to be in that same neighbourhood, because there's a risk of concentrations of particular mono tenures. You don't want, so there's a geography layered on this, I suppose, is what I'm saying.
Can we just talk about, can we go back a slide and if we get the points right. So look at this. This is, former Soviet Union bloc, former, behind the Iron Curtain, behind the Iron Curtain, behind the Iron Curtain, behind the Iron Curtain. Why is Eastern Europe got such a high owner occupancy and small amount of mortgages? The bulk of the population own the homes outright.
Exactly. So if we took that continuum that New Zealand goes with in terms of people, the home ownership being the sort of the holy grail, and having a property portfolio is even more hallowed, you would argue that Romania is in some sort of utopia there, wouldn't you, in terms of having a high amount of owner occupying. However, we've got to remember that this is sort of former social stock sold onto the market, and a lot of this stock, some of it would be okay quality, but some of it would be of poor quality. And people will be able to, have a right to take that property, often at a lower than market rate. You'll remember the days in the UK where there's sort of right to buy,
so
those sorts of things.
So what Thatcher did in the 80s, where sold, a lot of the social tenants could buy the houses. I mean,
so that's the same thing there. So that's en masse. You see that, and then we're looking at 95% of the own outright. But if you look through the lens of tenure, that's not telling the full story, because you got to think about the quality of the stock. And
I did have a look in Romania. I looked in Bucharest on a property website, and I could actually found that I could buy a rather reasonable house, like a 3-4 bedroom house at about 230,000 New Zealand dollars. So don't invest in Bucharest. I'm not telling people what to do, but it's interesting to just look at the different, countries and look at the difference in house prices. What I couldn't see is what's the average income. And I was also trying to work out what the rents were as well in Bucharest to see if I can estimate what the yields are. So
that's it. I mean, people do, from just a pure outright investment point of view, will be exploring where the best yields are around the world. You get Knight Frank, you get those Saville type reports where the people are actively investing in hot areas, whether it's Melbourne, Australia, etc., etc. But there's a certain, I'm sure, from a lay point of view, thinking, well, I'm not going to work in Romania, or I'm not going to work there. But that's why a lot of the conversations about functional housing markets, and a functional housing market is where people work and live. You know, so there's an investment question there that we can compare, and we can look at yields around the world, but we also have to be mindful of where people work and live.
Quality of life is what you're basically saying, isn't it? I suppose it's infrastructure, your work, your neighbourhood. I mean, you mentioned to me about Finland being apparently the happiest place in the world to live.
People can Google that. Maybe it's, I don't know whether it's you're deprived of sunlight in the winter time, and then suddenly your happiness has to jump exponentially. I don't know what it is, but yeah, there's, so yeah, I don't think it's, it might not be a question of tenure. There might be other factors at play, you know, in terms of social, you know, health services, et cetera, but that all ties into housing. You know, housing is such an interesting topic because it feeds into those health considerations, it feeds into work, it feeds into the economy, feeds into investment, et cetera.
So again, this graph shows it on a better scale, just purely on home ownership. We've got Romania here. We're very, I mean, a huge amounts of the population own outright. And then we can find New Zealand, which is here, which is showing that we've got really roughly just over 60% own the homes or have a mortgage on the home. Yeah, it seems to be in that kind of that little centre area. Sorry, go back. It seems to be in that bit of a centre area.
Yep. And owned outright is the red line we can see as that plays its way through. I think what isn't on there is New Zealand's a big second homer batch mentality in terms of investment in second homes. You're very much at the front end of that. So I think it's interesting to see how that's not in the picture, and how, you know, we could look at investment properties as well as that's percentage owned of each property. There might be people might sort of borrow against their owned house to obviously purchase further properties in their portfolio, and that would be an interesting sort of dynamic to see, because there's a certain, you know, we sometimes turn to culture and think about second homers as, you know, in a UK sense will be very different to how people see second homes in New Zealand. It's sort of it's quite celebrated to have your batch, isn't it?
It is. And we're very similar to Australia as well, looking at that. I was before interested looking to see what the home ownership of Ireland was like when you see that those property prices have come down, and Spain as well. So I suppose they've got higher occupancy or homeowner occupancy because they were so impacted by the GFC, and those prices still haven't quite come back. So it shows this is probably an argument of affordable housing, so more people can get into it. You know, we've got probably a third of the population now, which are going to struggle to get into home ownership without the help of the bank of mum and dad.
There's a lot of sort of layering of EU sort of considerations there as well. I was just, my eye was moving to Greece and looking at how that, interesting to see how that would have changed, you know, given the Greek financial crisis.
So here we've got rents in New Zealand, which have been really, oops, sorry, if I just press on here, and it's really been a consistent line. And my data, which I've looked at through MBIE, it's around about a 4 or 5% increase per annum. What we saw in provincial New Zealand, as I mentioned before, a much higher increase where Auckland kind of came back a bit post or around COVID, because a lot of people would have left the cities around COVID. A lot of people, overseas people in Auckland, would have gone back to the countries of origin, meaning that there's an oversupply of property, and some people have gone, right, let's get out of Auckland because we want to live with a little bit of greenery. We've still got this, we can work from home, I can have my little piece. Wairarapa is a prime example, where we've seen rents in Wairarapa go up really, I mean, close to 20% on stock which comes available to rent, which is phenomenal, really.
Transport's part of that, infrastructure's part of that.
The train. So, you know, but
I think as a national trend, it's quite uniform. Would be my argument. You know, the mathematicians would see that as a uniform line. There's no real sort of, you know, acceleration, you know, too much.
Does it get over politicized?
Does what get over
renting? If we're seeing
of course, if it starts to exponentially grow over a quick, you know, as we talked about with Portugal, you know, with that 15%. If you suddenly see it as a sharp increase, there's going to be some political noise behind that. You know, particularly the sort of pressures on tenants and pressures on landlords to be able to afford, you know, their side of the bargain.
So we've kind of got a similar property ownership model to the UK for obvious reasons. But
historical.
And what we asked you to do is have to look to see, you know, where if you go back the slide, New Zealand, it's been a consistent going across.
Yeah, you got Auckland baked into that, and here
Yeah.
we see the black line is excluding London. So you would have you can see how, I think here you're starting to see a fanning. I don't know if you'll be able to show it too well, but you can see as we move from 2008 all the way through to the current day, the gap between the blue line and the black line has widened. So if we exclude London out of the picture, it's a flatter rate. So what we're seeing in the blue line is an acceleration in the core cities, essentially London and the southeast, and that sort of widening effect of rents. So in short, rents are more problematic in London if we looked at these figures.
That's
cities.
Because what we see is that the rents have closed in provincial New Zealand to the main cities.
Yeah,
I mean we're here in Christchurch, or just on the outskirts of Christchurch. Rents in Palmerston North, where our head office is, are now equilibrium to Christchurch, and you'd argue that Christchurch is probably the second, third main city in the country, certainly the main city on the South Island.
Second most populous.
And probably when you look at infrastructure and from the rebuild from the earthquake, probably the best city in terms of value for money of what you get compared to your lifestyle.
Yeah, different profiles. I think I'm always told Christchurch is a lot a lot of supply and a lot of demand. So there's a volume there it tends to get saturated. Whereas Wellington, it's quite funneled, isn't it?
It is. It is, and there's a lot of bureaucracy in Wellington. US, I mean, what sticks out here for me, Graham, and this is the US apartment market, is the impact on COVID and post-COVID. There's whether the people have they wanted to get out their apartments. There's all the issues of living in boxed apartments in cities, and you've got COVID going rampant through places like New York. We saw remember the images on the news. But once COVID is finished, I mean, have people just come back to the cities, and it's put a big push on? Has it been the lack of development while COVID has gone on as well?
It's interesting, isn't it? You're sort of seeing, March 2020 is usually the big, so not a lot happening for almost a year, since we pressed the panic button. And then suddenly we're starting to see that rise, April 2021, keep going for a whole year.
Does the
cheap rents, and then it's starting to taper.
Does the cheap money that we saw have an impact on rent? Because basically, if you've got cheap money, low interest rates, people can borrow. Your loan to value ratios are quite low. Everyone went out and bought property around COVID time, drove up the prices. The yields reduce, puts pressure on. Does that put pressure on rents?
Some of that, yeah. I mean, I've done some academic work on the interrelationship between rental markets and house price markets, because they are interrelated. People are going to make decisions on whether they rent the property or not, depending on what's happening to the price of the house. So I think there is a sort of an integrated effect of what happens in house prices and what happens in rental prices. You've got to remember that renters are renters. They're going to just be paying a flat fee. Whereas the people who are owning and looking at yields, they're going to be looking at the relationship between rent and price to what returns they're going to get over a particular period of time.
Now, I asked you to take a look at Japan because I listened to this podcast on the BBC about Japan, and Japan seems to replace its housing stock all the time, and it actually has a lot of empty houses. What did you find? I mean, you've gone into Tokyo. It's got 23 wards. It's probably one of the most populated cities in the world. I don't know what the population will be. It's about 20 million, probably 4 or 5 times the population of New Zealand.
And I suppose that, big picture stuff in terms of the macro economy. Japan's famous for its sort of stagnant growth. In terms of it had the boom times, and then it's just sort of trickled along in terms of GDP. But the housing picture, and particularly here, is the rental picture in Tokyo, as you say, focusing on a populous city. We look at the timeline. We've got GFC, that gradual fall all the way down to that's 2013, and then a sort of an uptick, as we're seeing globally. You can see that global increase. But the COVID effects here is a plateau, and which is very different to the US, what we just looked at in that sharp rise.
But I think it had the Olympics going on as well, and there would have been a lot of workers in there getting prepared for the Olympics. Would that?
I think that's marginal. I think in terms of it's like conversations about the overseas buyers market. I think that's a very small percentage in terms of volume. but yeah, the understanding the whys of this. I mean, I think we can see my argument would be that sort of this Tokyo, Japan market is very bulky in the way that the market works. We've seen very sensitive markets in the other ones, very volatile markets. But this is sort of that Japan long game. You've seen a sort of a sweep. COVID's hitting, but it's not, we're not seeing spikes and troughs as much as we would elsewhere. So, I mean, we're seeing a sort of an uptick there, but the longer term trends, be interesting to see how that plays out.
Okay. Where does New Zealand sit in all of this in terms of rents compared to, so if I'm looking and going to do my own way in the tubes and I live in UK and decide I want to go and live in New Zealand, I mean, what I can see from this, we're quite an expensive country to live in terms of housing.
Yeah, you're going to, for a sort of a median income family, I think you've got the deposit question, I suppose, coming into it. So people are going to be making decisions on what their long-term trajectory and life course is. If you come in here for a year, you're going to make very different decisions to if you're thinking of settling down for making roots for 10, 20 years, aren't you? So you're going to play the long game. So if you can't get the deposit together, you're going to probably think about investing in your own house. Whereas if it's a year, you're just going to pay your rent and do what you need to do. So there's sort of, I suppose it depends on your life course you've laid on this, as well as trajectories of countries, which was sort of took in big picture. It's trajectories of people and what they want out of it,
Well, I've got a daughter renting in Manchester at the moment who's actually working in property management, and obviously you do your research, you look, and the rents in Manchester kind of now they've had big rent increases in recent times, and they're quite comparable now to the major cities of New Zealand. And we used to think when we first came here, we used to think New Zealand was really cheap. Then all of a sudden it became expensive, and the UK was quite cheap. Now the UK's gone quite expensive as well. To finish off with, Graham, I mean, this is like a little video on what we've got here. I've decided to get this off the OECD website. You should just be able to play, I think. There was just click it.
Click it should.
Yeah. Oh no, I have to go back. Here we go. And what this shows is rent at market price, and you're looking at where New Zealand is, and it's showing you've got a third in terms of home ownership, with a mortgage, without a mortgage, and it shows where New Zealand sits compared. And you can see down here how small amounts of the East European bloc actually rent very, very few. Then you click on who owns what. Again, you've got here Romania, 95% own outright. Croatia, 85%. Hungary, 79%. Come down, New Zealand, quite down the chart really. 31% own outright, 34% with a mortgage, 32% rent. But what you can see on the right-hand side, there's no social housing. There's very, very little social housing. When you compare United Kingdom, 20%. I mean, that's a huge amount. So the private rental sector in the UK is only 11%. The subsidised is quite high. So this, again, comes back to the point. We need more social housing.
Well, it's come out of your mouth, David. Do we need a social revolution? Is this what you're saying?
I don't.
I'm quickly.
I don't know if we, socialism, as you can see here.
There's politics in this market.
Yeah.
No, I think it paints a very interesting picture, doesn't it, in terms of tenure imbalances? And to my mind, I am politically apolitical in the conversation. However, I think there needs to be more consideration of sort of intermediate rents and how people move between tenures, that life course consideration of people, as well as the life trajectory of countries. We're seeing a whole new sort of wave of thinking in terms of decolonisation and ways in which we engage with global markets and engage with local markets. So there's lots to talk about.
Okay. Well, Graham, it's been very, very interesting. I'm supposed to look at the camera now that we've finished on the site. So, again, great research. You can download the regional rental report. So, New Zealand versus the world. This is our third copy of the year. And if you want any previous copies of Graham's research, it always really helps. But what we want to do at Property Brokers is provide that we're an education hub, not just for our property managers, but for our landlords and tenants as well. So you've got the best decisions being made. You've got the best advisors, which can help you in your property journey. Thanks for tuning in. If you've got any questions, you'll be able to email. What's the best way of getting hold of me, Graham?
Yeah, just Google me, Graham Squires, Lincoln University, or the Property Knowledge. Yeah, it's nice to be joining forces.
Yeah, and you can email me, david.faulkner@pb.co.nz, and always good to get your questions. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us. Nā te wā.